JP Morgan once said that a man always has two reasons for what he does: a good reason and the real reason. He built one of the most powerful banking institutions in history. He understood, better than almost anyone, that the financial system runs on two separate sets of rules. One set is published, the other is not. What Morgan never advertised, and what the system still doesn't, is that which rulebook applies to you depends almost entirely on how much you have. Not how hard you work, not how disciplined you are. How much do you have? Most people assume banks treat customers differently based on service tiers and product categories. That's the official explanation. The real one is simpler and more uncomfortable. Below certain dollar thresholds, you are a cost. Above them, you are an asset. And the way an institution treats a cost is nothing like the way it treats an asset. So why does nobody explain where those thresholds are, or what actually changes when you cross them? That's what this video is about. Because if you don't know which phase you're in, you can't play the right game. And the cost of playing the wrong one isn't a bad month, it's years. My name is Alex, and if you've ever felt like you're doing everything correctly, but the math still isn't working in your favor, stay with me. Because the rules aren't broken, they're just invisible. And I'm going to show you exactly where those lines sit and what the banking system quietly does the moment you cross them. Once you understand how these thresholds work, you'll stop wondering why the system feels tilted and start seeing precisely which direction it's tilted in. The first threshold is the one most people never clear. And the reason it's so brutal has nothing to do with discipline or income. It has everything to do with the puddle. Nobody warns you about the puddle. They tell you to save. They tell you to invest early, stay consistent, and trust the process. What they don't tell you is that for the first several years, it won't feel like any of that is working. And that feeling isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's just what this phase actually feels like from the inside. Getting to your first $100,000 in investable assets is the hardest stretch of the entire journey, not because the math is complicated, because the math is discouraging. This phase can take 7 to 10 years of genuine sacrifice, real trade-offs, real friction, real moments where you wonder if any of it is worth it. And while you're grinding through it, the banking system isn't cheering you on. It's charging you for the privilege of being there. Here's how that actually works. Banks don't think about you as a person. They run algorithms. And those algorithms are designed to extract maximum revenue from accounts that carry low balances and irregular cash flow. The most visible example is the overdraft fee. Currently, the average overdraft fee at a major US bank sits around $35. That number hasn't moved much in years, because it doesn't need to. It works exactly as designed. Think about what that fee actually represents. Your account dips $4 negative because a subscription was renewed a day before your paycheck landed. The bank covers it, then charges you $35 for the favor. That's an 875% fee on a $4 shortfall. No loan in the country carries that rate, but it's perfectly legal, perfectly automated, and applied without a single human making a judgment call. You aren't a customer in that moment. You're a line item. Consider someone like Marcus, a 29-year-old teacher in Ohio earning $58,000 a year. Responsible guy. Tracks his spending. Has a small emergency fund. But one month, his car needs a repair he didn't see coming, and the timing is bad. His account goes negative by $11 the day before payday. The bank charges him $35. Then another transaction clears the same day, a $12 streaming service, and he gets hit again. $70 in fees on a one-day cash flow problem. That's more than $100 an hour as a penalty rate. Marcus didn't make a reckless decision. He made a timing mistake. But the system doesn't distinguish between the two. And here's what makes this phase particularly brutal. It's not just the fees. It's the compounding psychology of small numbers. Say Marcus is putting $500 a month into an index fund, which is genuinely impressive discipline on his salary. At an 8% annual return, that $500 generates about $40 in growth that month. $40. He's working hard, staying consistent, doing everything right. And the market is handing him back roughly what he lost to one overdraft fee. It feels like running on a treadmill set slightly against you. This is what we call the puddle phase. Imagine filling an Olympic swimming pool with a garden hose. For the first few years, the water just spreads flat across the bottom. You can barely see it moving. The evaporation, the fees, the taxes, the small emergencies, keeps pace with what you're putting in. Compound interest, the thing everyone promises will change your life, is generating almost nothing at this scale because compound interest needs mass to do its job. You don't have mass yet. You have a puddle. Now you might be thinking, so what's the point? If the fees are punishing and the returns are invisible, why keep going? Because the puddle phase ends. It doesn't feel like it will. But the math changes on the other side in ways that are genuinely difficult to believe until you see them. The moment you cross $100,000, the same system that was algorithmically penalizing you begins, quietly, without announcement, to tilt in your favor. That shift has a name, and understanding what happens when you cross the breathing line is what makes the difference between people who build something and people who stay stuck just below it. The system doesn't send you a letter. There's no congratulations email. No banker calls to welcome you to a new tier. But something shifts. And if you know what to look for, you'll notice it. Crossing $100,000 in investable assets doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like relief. Quiet, almost suspicious relief. The math that felt broken for years suddenly starts behaving differently. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the direction changes. And direction, when compounding is involved, is everything. Here's the number that makes it concrete. At $10,000 invested, an 8% annual return generates about $67 a month. That's a tank of gas. It barely registers. But at $100,000, that same 8% generates roughly $667 a month. You didn't work harder. You didn't find a better investment. You just crossed a threshold where the size of the base finally gives the math room to breathe. That's the breathing line. The point where your money stops being a passenger and starts pulling its own weight. The snowball analogy gets used so often that it's lost its meaning, but the mechanics behind it are real and worth understanding precisely. Below 100,000, your monthly contributions are doing almost all the work. The market's growth on your balance is a rounding error. Above it, the ratio starts to flip. Your contributions still matter, but the growth on your existing balance begins to compete with them. By the time you're at 250,000, the market's annual return on your portfolio is generating more than most people can save in a year. You've crossed from manually pushing the snowball to watching it gather its own momentum. And here's what most people miss. The banking system notices this before you do. The algorithms that were flagging your account for overdraft risk begin recalibrating. Not because someone reviewed your file, because your average daily balance crossed an internal threshold. Suddenly, your credit card limit increases, automatically without a request. Your pre-approved loan offers improved. The interest rate on a car loan that might have been quoted at 10 or 11% a year ago quietly drops toward 6. These aren't rewards for good behavior. They're the system recognizing that lending to you has become mathematically safer. You are now a lower risk asset, and lower risk assets get better terms. Take someone like Diana, a 36-year-old marketing manager in Denver, earning $74,000 a year. She spent 8 years in the puddle, consistent, disciplined, occasionally frustrated. Then her balance crossed 100,000. She didn't change banks, didn't call anyone, but her credit limit went from 8,000 to 15,000 without a request. When she financed a used car shortly after, the dealer's financing came in at 6.4%. 2 years earlier, the same dealer had quoted her 9.8. Same credit score, roughly, different balance. The system had reclassified her, not as a person, but as a risk profile. And her cost of borrowing dropped accordingly. This matters beyond the numbers. When borrowing becomes cheaper, every large purchase in your life gets slightly more affordable. A lower mortgage rate over 30 years isn't a small thing. It's potentially tens of thousands of dollars. The breathing line doesn't just change your investment returns. It changes the price of everything you finance for the rest of your life. Now, is this fair? Probably not in the way most people would define fairness. The people who need the lowest borrowing costs, the ones with the least, pay the most. The ones who need the fees waived the least get them waived automatically. That's not an accident or an oversight. It's the architecture of a system built around risk, not need. Understanding that isn't cynicism, it's clarity. And once you have that clarity, the next question becomes obvious. What changes when the number isn't just large enough to lower your costs, but large enough to change your relationship with work entirely? That's what $500,000 does. Not luxury, not retirement, something more immediately powerful than either. It gives you walkaway power, and that changes the negotiation you're having with every employer, every landlord, and every institution that currently assumes you can't afford to say no. Most people think financial security means having enough to retire. It doesn't. It means having enough that losing your job stops being a catastrophe. That's a much lower number than retirement, and it changes everything about how you move through the world. $500,000 in investable assets is not a finish line. It's not the point where you quit working or buy the beach house, but it is the point where something fundamental shifts in your relationship with work, and with every institution that has quietly been counting on your financial desperation to keep you compliant. Because at this threshold, using a conservative 4% withdrawal rate, your portfolio generates $20,000 a year entirely passively. That's not a fortune. But $20,000 a year is approximately the federal poverty line for a single adult in the United States. What that means, practically, is that you can survive without a paycheck. Not comfortably, not indefinitely at your current lifestyle, but survive. And survival without a paycheck is the foundation of every negotiation you will ever have with an employer. Think about how most workplace dynamics actually function. Your employer sets the terms. You accept them. The hours, the pay, the culture, the creeping scope of what's expected, because the alternative is an income gap you can't afford. The threat doesn't need to be spoken. It's structural. When your rent, your car payment, and your family's health insurance all depend on next Friday's direct deposit, your leverage in any negotiation is close to zero. You can advocate for yourself up to a point. Then the math takes over. $500,000 changes that math. Not completely, but enough. Consider someone like Raymond, a 41-year-old project manager at a logistics firm in Atlanta, earning $88,000 a year. He'd spent 12 years building carefully, maxing his 401k, that's his employer retirement account, keeping lifestyle inflation in check, staying in a house he'd outgrown because the mortgage was manageable. When his portfolio crossed $500,000, something shifted in how he carried himself at work. Not arrogance, clarity. When his director asked him to absorb a second team's workload without additional compensation, Raymond said no professionally, directly, without a prepared speech. He said no because getting fired had stopped being a death sentence. His money was generating $20,000 a year in the background. He had a runway. He had time. He had, for the first time in his career, genuine options. His director backed down. Raymond got a formal title change and a 12% raise 3 months later. The negotiation worked not because Raymond was more skilled than before, but because the financial pressure that had always been quietly winning those negotiations on his employer's behalf had been removed. This is Walkaway Power, and it's worth understanding precisely because it's so rarely discussed in those terms. Most financial advice tells you to build an emergency fund. 3 months of expenses, 6 months, that's survival thinking. Defensive, reactive, just enough to cushion a fall. Walkaway Power is different. It's not a cushion. It's leverage. It changes the posture you bring to every professional relationship, every contract, every conversation where someone is implicitly counting on the fact that you need this more than they do. Simultaneously, the banking relationship transforms again at this level. You move from standard retail banking into what institutions call wealth management. The language changes, the access changes. You're no longer routed to a general customer service line. You get a dedicated advisor, someone whose job is to understand your complete financial picture, not just sell you a product. Loan approvals that used to take days happen in hours. Fee waivers that used to require a phone call happen automatically. Why? Because at $500,000, capturing your full financial life, your investments, your mortgage, your estate planning, your business accounts, is enormously profitable for the institution. You have become worth keeping. But here's what's worth sitting with for a moment. Walkaway Power is real and valuable. It protects you. It levels the playing field in ways that genuinely matter. What it doesn't do is free you from the equation of trading time for money. You still need the job. You just need it less desperately. Freeing yourself from that equation entirely requires a different threshold altogether, one where your capital becomes more productive than your labor, where the return on your money exceeds what you could earn by working, where the inversion point flips the entire logic of how you spend your time. That number is $2.5 million. And the rules at that level don't just tilt in your favor. They operate in a different system entirely. There is a number where your capital becomes more valuable than your time. Most people never find it. Not because it's unreachable, but because nobody ever explains what it actually means when you get there. $2.5 million is that number. And the reason it matters isn't lifestyle, it's math. At $2.5 million, generating a conservative 6% annual return, your portfolio produces $150,000 a year, passively, without a meeting, without a deliverable, without a performance review. That number, for most professionals in the United States, exceeds what they earn from working, which means something profound has happened to the logic of your life. Below this threshold, your most valuable economic asset is your time, the hours you can sell, the skills you can deploy, the career capital you can accumulate. Above it, your most valuable asset is your capital. And capital doesn't sleep, doesn't negotiate, and doesn't need health insurance. This is the inversion point, the moment the equation flips. And here's what makes it genuinely counterintuitive. Once you cross it, working harder in the traditional sense becomes economically inefficient, grinding out 60 hours a week to earn an extra $20,000 in salary when your portfolio is already generating $150,000 is a poor allocation of your most finite resource, your time. That doesn't mean you stop working. Most people at this level are deeply engaged in something, but the reason you work changes entirely. You're no longer selling time out of necessity. You're deploying energy toward what actually interests you. That distinction, quiet as it sounds, reshapes everything about how a day feels. Now here's the part worth being honest about. Almost nobody reaches $2.5 million through salary alone. The math simply doesn't support it for most people. Even a disciplined professional earning $100,000 a year, saving aggressively, investing consistently, the compounding journey to that number takes decades on wages alone. What actually gets people there faster is ownership, business equity, real estate, stock in something that scales beyond your personal hours. The inversion point is rarely crossed by someone who only ever traded time for money. It's crossed by people who, at some point, acquired an asset that grew independently of their labor. Consider someone like Christine, a 47-year-old who spent 15 years as a pharmacist, saved methodically, and invested a portion of her income in a small commercial property in her mid-30s. By the time her portfolio, combined investments and property equity, crossed $2.5 million, the rental income and dividends alone were generating more annually than her pharmacy salary. She didn't quit immediately, but she renegotiated her hours, dropped to 4 days a week, and turned down a regional director role that would have consumed her life. She didn't need the title. The inversion point had already changed the calculation. At this tier, the banking experience stops resembling anything the average person encounters. You enter private banking, not wealth management. That's the previous tier. Private banking is a separate ecosystem that exists inside the same building most people walk past every day without knowing what's on the upper floors. Here, the standard rate sheet doesn't apply. Mortgage terms are negotiated, not selected from a menu. Investment structures exist that aren't advertised publicly. Fee arrangements are bespoke. When an exception needs approving, it's approved before a manager is formally consulted, because the relationship manager's job is to keep you, and losing you would be a career-level problem for them personally. You're not an account number at this level. You are a named relationship. The institution has structured itself around you, not the other way around. Is this a different world? Yes. Is it fair that the rules of finance operate so differently depending on which side of these thresholds you sit on? That's a harder question. But fairness doesn't change the mechanics. Understanding the mechanics does. And understanding them requires one more step. Because reaching the inversion point is only half the challenge. The other half is what happens in your own head when the rules change. Because the people who lose it all from this level almost never lose it to bad markets or bad luck. They lose it to something quieter and more dangerous. That's what the final section is really about. Not a strategy, not numbers, mental models, and what happens when you fail to update them. The most dangerous moment in building wealth isn't when you have nothing. It's when you finally have something, and you're still running the software from when you didn't. Every phase in this journey has a mental model attached to it, a set of assumptions about risk, about opportunity, about what the right move looks like from where you're standing. Those assumptions are built slowly, through years of experience inside a specific set of constraints. And they work, right up until the constraints change. When they change and the mental model doesn't, that's where things quietly begin to fall apart. This isn't a modern problem. Nicolas Fouquet was the French finance minister under Louis XIV in the mid-1600s. He was extraordinarily wealthy, politically connected, and genuinely brilliant at accumulating power. He threw a party at his estate in 1661, a celebration so extravagant, so deliberately impressive, that it effectively demonstrated to the king that a subject had outgrown his place. Louis XIV had Fouquet arrested 3 weeks later. He died in prison 19 years after the party. Fouquet had reached a level of wealth where the old rules, impress the powerful, display your status, signal your resources, had become actively dangerous. He never updated the model. The model killed him. Robert Morris financed significant portions of the American Revolution, essentially keeping the Continental Army operational through his personal credit and connections. He crossed every threshold we've discussed. And then, in the years after the war, he speculated wildly on land, operating with the risk appetite of someone still trying to make his first fortune, while managing the balance sheet of someone who had already made several. He died effectively bankrupt, having spent time in debtor's prison. Same man, same intelligence, wrong mental model for the phase he was in. These aren't cautionary tales about greed. They're cautionary tales about miscalibration, about running yesterday's strategy on today's position. So what does updating your mental model actually look like in practice? It starts with an honest assessment of which phase you're currently in, and which phase your current behavior assumes you're in. These are often different. Someone with $400,000 who is still optimizing every expense, as though they're in the puddle phase, is miscalibrated in one direction. Someone with $80,000 taking on leveraged real estate risk, as though they've already crossed the inversion point, is miscalibrated in the other. Both are playing the wrong game for their threshold. Here's a rough map of what the right game looks like at each level. Below 100,000, the only objective is surviving the puddle. That means ruthless expense management, automated savings, and protecting your consistency from the fees and friction the system will throw at you. The enemy at this stage isn't the market. It's a dropout. Most people who fail here don't lose money. They just stop. Between 100,000 and 500,000, the objective shifts. You've earned some momentum. The job now is to protect it, let compounding do its work, and resist the lifestyle inflation that tends to accelerate precisely when things start feeling easier. This is the phase where people buy too much house, lease the car they've been delaying, and quietly undo years of discipline in 18 months. At and above 500,000, the focus shifts again toward building walkaway power into actual structural freedom and beginning to think seriously about ownership, because you almost certainly cannot save your way to $2.5 million on a salary. The math is too slow. Ownership, equity in a business, real estate that generates cash flow, stock in something with asymmetric upside, is what bridges the gap between where compounding gets you and where the inversion point actually sits. And above the inversion point, the mental model that needs the most aggressive updating is the one around risk. At $2.5 million, preservation and selective deployment beat accumulation every time. The goal is no longer to build the pile. The goal is to not lose it, while letting it continue to generate the passive income that bought your freedom in the first place. The through line across all of it is simpler than it sounds. Know which game you're playing. Play that game. And when the threshold changes, change with it. Because the people who don't, the Fouquets, the Robert Morrises, the cautionary figures across every era of financial history, didn't fail because they lacked intelligence or discipline or opportunity. They failed because they kept winning at a game that had already moved on without them. Here is what this all comes down to. The banking system is not neutral. It is not broken. It is working exactly as designed, and the design rewards people who understand which phase they are in and punishes people who don't. The thresholds are real. The puddle phase is brutal by architecture, not by accident. The breathing line is where momentum finally compounds on itself. Walkaway power changes every negotiation you will ever have. And the inversion point doesn't just change your finances, it changes the entire logic of how you spend your time. None of this requires perfection. It requires orientation, knowing where you are, playing the right game for that position, and updating the mental model every time the threshold changes, because the model that got you here will not get you there. The question worth sitting with now is this: which phase are you actually in? And is your current behavior designed for that phase, or for the one you used to be in? There is a related question that this video didn't fully answer. How does inflation interact with these thresholds over time? And does the breathing line actually move faster than most people can save toward it? That one is worth exploring next. If this reframed something for you, share it with someone who is still in the puddle and wondering why the math isn't working yet. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on how money actually moves, not how we're told it does.